Disclaimer: Scientology is cringe. Also, this video contains spoilers for all 6 Mission Impossible movies. There are time codes in the description if you want to jump around. We all good? Alright, now let's get this show on the road. The year is 1966, and nothing is getting people into movie theaters quite like spy movies. For the past 4 years, Sean Connery has torn up the big screen across 4 consecutive James Bond films, each more successful than the last, with a 5th on the way for 1967. But the world of spycraft and espionage didn't only have to live on the big screen, and that's where television writer Bruce Geller took the stage. He moved to create an all-new series that'd bring espionage and spy tactics to the small screen every week. This show was none other than Mission Impossible. Mainly inspired by the film Topkapi, most specifically its methodical and mainly dialogue-free approach to an elaborate heist sequence. Mission Impossible featured a small team of secret agents under the banner of the IMF, or the Impossible Missions Force, who together would take on daring and seemingly impossible adventures every week, thwarting the plans of evildoers by the skin of their teeth. The show's first season consisted of the main team Dan Briggs, played by Stephen Hill, Cinnamon Carter, played by Barbara Bain, Barney Collier, played by Greg Morris, Willie Armitage, played by Peter Lupus, and Roland Hand, played by Martin Landau. Then, Season 2 brought in new cast member Peter Graves as the character Jim Phelps, who would ultimately become the show's de facto main character. And as the show continued, a revolving door of cast members came and went, such as Leonard Nimoy as Paris in Seasons 4 and 5, Sam Elliott as Dr. Doug Robert in Season 5, and Linda Day George as Lisa Casey in Seasons 6 and 7. Lasting 7 seasons, the show was a ratings success. Its simple and easy-to-follow formula allowed audiences to tune into any given episode and be fully enraptured in the stakes of the story. That was backed by perhaps one of the most iconic pieces of music in entertainment history. Lalo Schifrin created a fun, sleek, fast-tempoed piece of music that immediately set the tone for the episode that would follow, and has since become synonymous with this brand of fun, exciting stealth. Eventually, however, the series would come to an end in 1973, but its legacy would live on, as 15 years later in 1988, ABC revived the show for a whole new generation. Though the reasoning behind the revival was far from genuine, as a writer's strike had plagued the industry for many months, meaning studios quickly ran out of finished scripts for TV, and as such they started plucking through the vault to put anything they could onto the air. As such, the Mission Impossible revival consisted of unused scripts from the first run, just upgraded a bit to fit the new era. But even with those upgrades, Peter Graves still led the charge as Jim Phelps, surrounded by a whole new team of IMF agents. Unfortunately, however, after a schedule change during the revival's second season, ratings dropped dramatically, resulting in its cancellation in 1990. For some franchises, the story might end there. They gave it another shot, and it didn't work out. But perhaps Mission Impossible could thrive in the one place spy films had thrived for decades: the big screen. Paramount Pictures had had the rights to create a film adaptation for many years, but nothing ever really came together. That was until the arrival of one Tom Cruise, who'd already proven himself a box office powerhouse with movies like Top Gun, A Few Good Men, and most recently, The Firm. But now, he and producing partner Paula Wagner had created their own production company to give Cruise more creative freedom over his projects. And with Tom Cruise actually being a fan of the original series, it was decided that Mission Impossible would be the company's very first project, securing roughly $70 million from Paramount Pictures. This is where it all began. This is where a simple yet fun espionage TV series would evolve to become perhaps one of the best action franchises of all time. Now, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to take a journey over the next 30 years to break down how exactly this series came to be what it is today, as it is now time to light the fuse and jump right into If you're enjoying the video, like and subscribe, it helps out a lot. Alright, this message will self-destruct in 5 seconds, so let's get started. With Tom Cruise on board and the machine officially rolling, the next step was clear. It was time to find a director. For months after the release of The Firm, moves were made to get that film's director Sidney Pollack on board, which would continue the working relationship between him and Tom Cruise. But for one reason or another, Sidney Pollack left the project, bringing things back to square one. That was until one of Tom Cruise's many dinners with director Steven Spielberg. Yeah, they just had dinner together from time to time. But this particular meeting also brought along a surprise third guest, none other than Brian De Palma. De Palma's previous work included such box office hits like Carrie, Scarface, The Untouchables, among many others, all of which Tom Cruise marathoned in a single day. After which he was completely convinced that Brian De Palma was the man to helm Mission Impossible. But the search for a screenwriter did not come quite so spectacularly. In fact, over the course of 1994, plenty of writers came in and out of pre-production, as there were plenty of proposed stories that either De Palma or Cruise were simply not happy with. Eventually, though, David Koepp was brought in to rewrite the script. Steven Zaillian also became involved, but ultimately would only get a story credit. And then David Koepp eventually also had to step away from the project to direct his own film, The Trigger Effect. But he did ultimately submit a draft of the script, which is where Robert Towne came in, to pick up where the others left off to bring the script to fruition, or at least as close to fruition as possible. As such, the ball was now rolling, and towards the tail end of the year, casting began for the principal characters that would take the stage alongside Tom Cruise. Firstly, in December was Emmanuel Béart, and following that in the early months of 1995, the cast continued to expand with the addition of Henry Czerny, and perhaps most significantly, Jon Voight and Ving Rhames. Ving Rhames was cast as a computer hacker, and was specifically chosen because he looked nothing like a stereotypical computer hacker for the time. And Jon Voight was going to be taking on the role of Jim Phelps. That's right, the central character of both versions of the TV show was going to make it to the big screen. In fact, he was the only character that was going to make the jump. Mainly because some of the cast members, including Martin Landau and even Peter Graves, the original actor for Jim Phelps, were not super thrilled with the pitches they'd seen for the big screen adventure. It was too different, too action-packed, and would have potentially seen all of the original cast members die to make room for an all-new IMF team. Despite the lack of support from some of the original cast, though, filming on Mission Impossible swiftly got underway in March of 1995, filming in the city of Prague. In fact, Mission Impossible was the biggest blockbuster production to have ever filmed in Prague, taking production across many of the city's breathtaking locations. The production spent the other half of its time filming in London, most specifically Pinewood Studios. But even during filming, the scripting difficulties still reared their ugly head. The film actually went into production without a finished script, with Brian De Palma crafting many of the set pieces on his own, which the script would have to somehow justify and form a story around. And during filming, David Koepp was brought back alongside Robert Towne to write and rewrite scenes on the fly, even rewriting between individual takes. But even with these hurdles, production reportedly ran quite smoothly, running until its conclusion in August of 1995, coming in on time and under budget, which was rare for Hollywood. But now, with production concluded, the only thing left was to start getting the word out to audiences. The marketing campaign began right away, as at the tail end of 1995, audiences got their first look at the big screen adaptation in the form of a teaser trailer. Set to a killer updated rendition of the original classic theme, the teaser trailer played like an intro sequence for the original show. A montage of cool action, visuals, glimpses of the stunts, whilst giving nothing away in terms of the specifics of the story. It was fast, energetic fun, and got audiences ready as the clock soon turned to the year, which was proving to be a heavy hitter in terms of summer blockbusters, with audiences getting excited for plenty of the big event films in the early months of the year. And Mission Impossible got its hand in the ring in a big way, cementing its status as one of the summer's most hotly anticipated movies with the spring release of the full theatrical trailer.
Good morning, Mr. Phelps. This is your mission should you choose to accept it.
Featuring more iconography from the original series, this trailer greatly expanded what audiences knew about the story, this time showing that Tom Cruise's character Ethan Hunt was disavowed by the IMF and out on his own. A mystery is afoot, and Hunt has to unravel the plot in an exciting adventure with action the likes of which audiences had never seen before. From exploding tanks of water to a helicopter chasing a speeding train through a tunnel, the movie was gonna wow audiences the world over as they were told to expect the impossible. Anticipation rose to a fever pitch in the remaining weeks leading up to release. A prequel comic was released by Paramount and Marvel Comics, detailing Ethan Hunt's adventures prior to the events of the movie. A web adventure was released from Apple Computer, which also coincided with Apple's own product tie-in with the movie itself. Although the product that was set to feature in the film, the Power Book, was recalled mere weeks before the movie's release, so that didn't quite work out. And of course, U2 was approached to create a slight variation on the classic Mission Impossible theme. While the entire band themselves did not make the theme as they were busy working on their next album, two members of the band, Adam Clayton and Larry Mullen, spent any spare time they could creating a hip, new 90s upgrade of the iconic tune. And upon the song's release, it immediately topped the charts, becoming one of the most popular songs of the year. Audiences were pumped. They were ready to jump on over to theaters for what promised to be an incredibly exciting adventure. Even the premiere was filled to the brim with celebrities who were all jazzed to see what Cruise, De Palma, and the entire crew had cooked up. And all led to May 22nd, 1996, where 30 years after the debut of the original series, Mission Impossible had finally made its way to the big screen. It was now time for audiences to take their seats and accept their new mission. Like the audience, Jim Phelps has just been given a new mission. Half of a classified knock list is in play, and Phelps must ensure that it does not get out into the open. He must assemble a team of IMF agents to take down the buyer, the seller, and retrieve the knock list all in one go. And who better to take on this mission than some of the best IMF agents around? Ethan Hunt, Point Man, Hannah Williams, Eye in the Sky, Sarah Davies, Sleuth Extraordinaire, Claire Phelps, Transport Lead, and Jack Harmon, Computer Genius. Wait, is that Emilio Estevez? Ah, I didn't know he was in this. That's pretty neat. Well, he's not in it for long because during this pivotal mission, the entire team is suddenly killed off. Jack is stabbed in the face by the roof of an elevator shaft, Sarah is stabbed by an unknown assailant, and Hannah is, well, not even Jim Phelps survives, as he's shot by another unknown assailant and winds up falling off of a bridge into the river below. Ethan Hunt now remains one of the only survivors. But the real twist comes when Kittredge, the director of the IMF, reveals that the mission was a ruse. There are parties interested in the completed knock list, but this particular event was staged in order to weed out a mole within the IMF. And given that Ethan Hunt is the only one left, all suspicions point towards him.
I can understand you're very upset. Kittredge, you've never seen me very upset.
Which leads to perhaps one of the most impressive stunts in the movie, the sudden explosion of a massive fish tank. Not only was the detonation set up earlier with Jack introducing Hunt to the stick of gum that when crushed together, it'll explode in 5 seconds, but the effect is all practical. The production let loose 16 tons of water, which Tom Cruise himself outran. It was initially planned that a stunt guy was going to play as Hunt in the scene, but it ultimately looked unconvincing. So either by request of Brian De Palma or even Tom Cruise himself, Cruise did the stunt, running away from the immense force of water behind him, and let me tell you, it turned out pretty good. But now, Ethan Hunt has been disavowed from the IMF, and along with Claire Phelps, the only other surviving member of the team, he gets himself tangled in a web to both expose the true mole, as well as find the buyer of the knock list and take them all down in one fell swoop. Which means Ethan Hunt needs a team of his own, recruiting 2 more agents from the IMF disavowed list, Franz Krieger and of course, Luther Stickle, played by the one and only Ving Rhames. All of which boils down to a sleek, fun, exciting film with likable characters, fun moments, a solid performance from Tom Cruise, and action that blew audiences away. Establishing plenty of the most iconic staples of Mission Impossible, not the least of which is the tearaway mask reveal, of which there are 2 in this movie. Almost 3, but that one gets cut off kinda early, so The score by Danny Elfman won some points as well, although his involvement came pretty late in the day, as Alan Silvestri was initially set to take on the score, but his stab at it was not received well by test audiences. As such, on a wildly condensed timeline, Danny Elfman took over and provided a score that accentuated the fun, heroic nature of the rest of the movie, as well as, in a genius move, bringing back the iconic theme from the TV series. But that theme wasn't the only piece of music brought back, as another track titled The Plot was also used a handful of times, tying things back to the beginning. But what really brings it home is the direction by Brian De Palma. His signature is all over this movie, from the continuous use of Dutch tilt, split diopter shots, and especially getting up close and personal with the camera in a number of scenes. But what really sticks out is the use of sound, or rather, the lack thereof, because for a movie of this scale it is actually quite quiet. Rarely does anyone raise their voices, every character is often calm and collected. There are only 2 moments where Ethan Hunt gets angry enough to start yelling, and that use of quiet or even silence is at the center of the titular sequence of the movie, because after recruiting Luther and Krieger, the 4 disavowed agents make a plan to steal the real knock list from inside the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Now, the title of this movie provides an interesting challenge for the filmmakers. I mean, any other movie would still have to set up a sufficient amount of stakes for a heist sequence like this, but none of them are called Mission Impossible. The audience isn't expecting this to be hard, difficult, challenging, no, none of that. They're expecting it to be impossible. If it's not impossible, why the hell are they here? So, do the filmmakers succeed in making this heist seem impossible? Let's find out. Firstly, the security systems in place guarding the knock list are very clearly set up. The knock list is kept on a computer at the center of this room. 2 different security doors hold back the only employee who's been cleared to enter. Voice recognition, retinal scan, the whole 9 yards. And when the employee isn't in the room, security systems expect it to be dead silent. Anything more than a whisper, and the alarm will sound. The system expects no person to be inside, so if the temperature rises even a degree above normal due to body heat, the alarm will sound. And finally, the system expects that no one will be standing on the floor, so if even a tiny drop of water makes contact, the alarm will sound. Yeah, that sounds pretty impossible to me. And that clear and concise setup allows this to be the most thrilling sequence in the entire movie. The entire team has to be dead silent. No music plays as Ethan Hunt is lowered from a vent in the roof so as not to make contact with the floor. The only employee allowed in has been given something that makes him puke, so he'll be out for a little while. But complications arise, as while Ethan does successfully access the computer and download the knock list, Krieger, holding him up from the vent above, encounters a rat. What a tiny thing, a tiny little creature, but if it moves the wrong way, the whole thing goes down. It inches closer and closer as Hunt downloads the file until suddenly... Now, if that doesn't make you grasp onto your seat, I don't know what will. But it gets worse, as a single drop of sweat slowly rolls down Hunt's glasses, and then another. It builds and builds until it suddenly falls from the glasses and... Oh, that was a close one. Too close. But ultimately, Hunt succeeds in retrieving the knock list, but on their way out, Krieger drops his knife, which, at the last second, alerts Kittredge that they were inside and that they have the real list. Hunt and the team still manage to get away, and with the list in his possession, Hunt finally begins to unravel the mystery, just as it's revealed to him that Jim Phelps is alive. But how? How is Phelps alive? Well, this leads into a really well-conceived sequence which sees Phelps tell his side of the story, how he got out and who he thinks the mole is. But simultaneously, we see Hunt piece together the real story. Jim Phelps is the mole. Jim Phelps killed the team of agents, with Krieger by his side, a payoff that was really well set up by the continuous reminders of his knife. And all of this leads into the final climactic action set piece on the speeding train. It's here that all of the pieces come together. Max, the buyer, is on the train and she's got got the knock list. Kittredge knows the knock list is here, and he's also looking for Hunt. And Hunt's just discovered that Claire Phelps is also in on Jim's game. The walls are closing in around Hunt, but it turns out this was his plan the whole time. He's got Phelps right where he wants him and can now reveal to Kittredge that Phelps is alive and that Phelps is the mole. Which leads to a nice book-ending line from the beginning of the movie, because that message given to Phelps at the start of the movie was narrated by Kittredge, where he begins by saying,
"Good morning, Mr. Phelps."
And now, with all of the cards on the table, once Kittredge learns the truth, he says,
"Good morning, Mr. Phelps."
It's a small thing, but it's a really nice little payoff. Now, Jim Phelps is the one cornered, but he's got Ethan Hunt at gunpoint, so he pulls the trigger and shoots Claire. Yeah, he shot Claire first. I mean, on top of being a traitor, I guess the guy's also a misogynist, so, there's that. But now, the action really heats up for the biggest set piece of the movie. While silence was used to great effect during the Langley heist sequence, this final action scene puts everything on the table. It's big, exciting, and explosive. The visual effects combined with the practical effects are truly incredible. A life-size train car was created, built against a blue screen wall to replace the background, and a massively powerful fan, the same kind used in skydiving simulators, which can create winds up to 140 miles an hour, was used to not just blow around the actors' hair, but have a legitimate effect on their faces. All of it comes together in a thrilling sequence where a helicopter chases a speeding train through an underground tunnel. Is it a little fantastical? Sure, but it works to close this movie out with a bang, and I mean that literally. As that gum that was set up earlier comes back for one final payoff as Ethan Hunt uses it to finally destroy the helicopter, killing both Krieger and Jim Phelps in one fell swoop. And with a glorious miniature explosion, the action comes to an end. Max is taken in by Kittredge, the knock list is kept safe, Luther is taken off the disavowed list, and Hunt? Well, Hunt doesn't know if he'll come back to the IMF just yet. But as he's heading home on an airplane, he receives an all-new mission, should he choose to accept it. The book ending of Hunt on the plane really sends a concrete message. While the original show and even the start of this movie were all about Jim Phelps, we're now in the age of Ethan Hunt, and it doesn't look like we'll be leaving anytime soon. Mission Impossible received largely positive reviews from critics, praising the action sequences, Tom Cruise's performance, and the fast pace the movie kept up from start to finish. Though some critics weren't as big of fans, mainly criticizing how different it was from the original series. Some criticisms were drawn specifically towards the characterization of Jim Phelps. He was a hero, why would he turn traitor? But questions like that quickly became unimportant as this Tom Cruise vehicle immediately lit up the box office. Not only debuting on a record 3,000 screens, but also making more money in its first 6 days than any other before it, surpassing Jurassic Park for a monstrous $74 million. And across its run, it grossed a massive $180 million domestically and $457 million worldwide, becoming the third biggest movie of 1996, only trailing behind Twister and Independence Day. Audiences were eating up this taste of action spycraft, and once the credits rolled, they only had one question on their minds. When will Ethan Hunt accept his next mission? But unfortunately for them, the answer to that question became a little complicated. Up to this point in his career, Tom Cruise had never done a sequel. Not once, not a sequel to Top Gun, Interview with a Vampire, nothing. So to jump into a sequel to Mission Impossible was an unusual prospect to be sure. And perhaps because of that unusual experience, the road to getting a Mission Impossible sequel off the ground was a long and arduous one at best. A few months after the release of the first movie, William Goldman signed on to write the sequel, with Brian De Palma in talks to direct, set for a release in the summer of 1998. But ultimately, Brian De Palma turned down working on the sequel, resetting things back to square one. As such, in the early months of 1997, Tom Cruise and Paula Wagner were instead pining for Oliver Stone to write and direct Mission Impossible 2. Oliver Stone and Tom Cruise had of course worked together before on Born on the 4th of July, and this partnership looked looked like it was going somewhere. For the bulk of the year, the machine started moving, a screenplay started being written, and Oliver Stone even publicly discussed his interest and approach to the sequel. Things were looking up. But after a while, Michael Tolkien was suddenly brought in to rewrite the script. Maybe the script drafts that had been written weren't up to par. Regardless, it was only a few weeks later that Oliver Stone ultimately stepped away. De Palma was out, Stone was out, and while there were reports of Wong Kar-wai taking on the sequel, those never really went anywhere. As such, it seemed that MI2 might be dead in the water. That was until February of 1998, where finally a massive amount of excitement was generated when none other than John Woo signed on to direct. John Woo, of course, had massive success making Hong Kong action movies before taking his chops to Hollywood for movies like Hard Target, Broken Arrow, and Face Off. Clearly a very different voice than Brian De Palma, which sent a clear message about Tom Cruise's approach to these Mission Impossible sequels. Each one would be a completely different beast. A new mission, a new director, a new style, all to keep it fresh, exciting, and to provide something completely unique to audiences. And now, with John Woo on board, casting was underway. In fact, even before there was a script, Thandiwe Newton was cast as the female lead alongside Tom Cruise. With her involvement, a character was written for her to best utilize her strengths. Following that, Dougray Scott joined the cast along with Ving Rhames. That's right, Luther Stickle is back, the only returning player from the first movie outside of Tom Cruise. We do love that. All of which led to the year 1999, where even Ian McKellen was in talks to join the film. But despite these pieces moving forward, the script still had a long way to go, with Ronald D. Moore and Brannon Braga approached to write an all-new draft. They, of course, had plenty of success writing for Star Trek both on TV and on the big screen. Despite this latest writing change, however, the machine was underway, with a large chunk of production set to take place in Australia, specifically the city of Sydney. It was actually a rare occurrence of not only filming in Sydney, but having the movie take place in Sydney, following up on the first film's trend of filming in previously underused locations. But mere days before filming was set to begin, news struck the crew that production had been halted for an entire month. This was reportedly due to the production side of things moving too fast, leaving the scripting side unable to keep up. During this time, Robert Towne was brought in to help write the script, ultimately getting the final screenwriting credit on the film. And on top of that, this delay had some fairly significant casting reverberations through Hollywood. Originally, Steve Zahn was set to take part in the film, but was ultimately replaced with Australia's own John Poulson. Ian McKellen was forced to drop out, instead freeing his schedule to take on both Magneto in the upcoming X-Men film and Gandalf in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, which ultimately led to Anthony Hopkins taking on the MI2 role in his place. And finally, Dougray Scott's commitment to MI2 meant that he could no longer take on the role of Wolverine in the aforementioned X-Men film, with that role instead going to Hugh Jackman. Talk about some what-if scenarios. It was a pretty significant month in hindsight, let me tell you. But ultimately, production did finally get underway on April 19th, 1999, filming across the spring and summer in Australia, Utah, and Los Angeles for a planned 88-day shoot. But like everything on MI2, even production had some issues, ultimately extending the planned 88-day shoot into a whopping 180 days once all was said and done. Weather issues, injuries, reported issues between Australian and American crews, as well as reported disagreements between Tom Cruise and John Woo, were among the most significant factors that led to this wildly extended production. This production extension even led to the release date being pushed back from its planned December 17th release to instead debut on May 24th, 2000. While unfortunate, this did mean that Mission Impossible 2 was going to become one of the first flagship summer blockbusters of the 21st century. Eventually, however, production finally drew to a close. The long and arduous shooting process had finally concluded. Now it was time to get the word out to audiences around the world. As such, before the end of the year, Paramount released the first official teaser trailer for Mission Impossible 2.
Good morning, Mr. Hunt.
Sorry I barged in on your vacation.
I don't think there could have possibly been a better attention grabber than spending half of this teaser with Tom Cruise climbing on 2,000 feet high cliffs in the mountains of Utah. I mean, just look at this. It looks insane. The guy even falls at one point. I mean, there's no better way to get audiences to remember your teaser than to have them sweating in their seats within the first 30 seconds. And following that, this teaser shows off incredible glimpses of slick action, impressive visuals, and an overall much different feel than the first one. While there were no hints at the story, this teaser definitely got people excited. They knew they were in for a wild ride once MI2 hit theaters in the summer of... As the new year got underway, marketing really began to heat up, as in March of 2000, Paramount continued to get the word out with an all-new theatrical trailer, released in a rather unconventional way, as Paramount released the new trailer on the websites Coming Attractions, Dark Horizons, and Ain't It Cool News, which were at the time considered the bane of Hollywood's existence. But in a slightly forward-thinking move, Paramount realized they could be used for some heavy-duty promotion. And with that, on March 9th, the full theatrical trailer for Mission Impossible 2 was released online. And in case you missed it the first time, this trailer also begins with Ethan Hunt climbing the incredibly high steep cliffs, all before transitioning into a huge showcase of action, crazy stunts, and even a little bit of romance. Overall, this entire second trailer is filled with tons and tons of little moments that would make anyone excited to see this bigger, bolder, brand new approach to the IMF. And in the remaining 2 months prior to release, promotion went full swing. MI2 quickly became one of the most anticipated movies of 2000, perhaps being the centerpiece of the entire summer movie season. And alongside an influx of TV spots, Mission Impossible once again made an impression on the music side of things. Limp Bizkit got in the game with a rock cover of the classic Mission Impossible theme, this time retitled Take a Look Around. And then, on top of that, Metallica came in with their own song, I Disappear, the music video of which featured a riff on this iconic scene from Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest. That song was also the catalyst to a massive lawsuit between Metallica and Napster, the repercussions of which are still being felt in the music industry today. But at the time, with these songs storming onto the Billboard charts and TV spots filling the airwaves, audiences were all in for the return of the IMF. And finally, after years of development issues, production issues, and even some post-production issues and last-minute hirings to get the movie done somewhat intact, May 24th had now arrived. It was now time to jump on over to theaters to witness Ethan Hunt in an all-new wicked haircut take on his next mission. To give you an idea of how different this movie is from its predecessor, the opening of this movie sees Tom Cruise as Ethan Hunt climbing on an impossibly high cliff, nearly falling to his death, staring out in this glorious looking shot, all before finally reaching the summit, where a helicopter finds him, shoots a missile at him that doesn't explode, but instead carries a pair of Oakley sunglasses that give Hunt his new mission. Then, before the message self-destructs, Hunt throws it towards the camera where it explodes right in our face, transitioning us right into the opening titles. And that energy is carried throughout the entire 2-hour runtime of this movie. It's not just that MI2 is different from the first, it's that every single creative choice is seemingly the complete opposite to what the first one would have done. Where the first one relied more on silence as a way of creating tension, this movie is balls to the wall. Everything's on the table at all times. This is the kind of movie to take a meeting between two people on a pier and turn it into a mythical scene of epic proportions. Some of that is due in part to the score, this time composed by Hans Zimmer. While rock and roll motifs are used quite frequently, specifically in the latest rendition of the theme, the score also carries this bombastic and massive energy to it. Every single moment feels big. It makes this whole thing feel incredibly important at all times. Meanwhile, this movie also features some crazy lines of dialogue, like this one from Anthony Hopkins, who plays Mission Commander Swanbeck.
You mean it'll be difficult?
Very.
Well, this is not mission difficult, Mr. Hunt. It's mission impossible. Difficult should be a walk in the park for you.
This stylistic approach is thanks to director John Woo, who takes his signature action filming style and lays it all over this movie. Slow motion, snap zooms, a nearly constantly moving camera, and of course, doves. I mean, it's got it all, along with some hallmarks of Mission Impossible, namely the tearaway mask reveal, which this movie does a total of 5 times, totally eclipsing the number from the first movie. And it all builds to a movie that, while it certainly has its flaws, if you were the right age when this came out, I can totally see this landing in someone's top 10 favorite movies of all time. But for me, this didn't land at the right time, so I kind of bump heads with it a bit. As different as this movie is from the first one, I'm not sure it all comes together. The story this time around sees Ethan Hunt face off against Sean Ambrose, another IMF agent who's gone rogue to hunt down a chemical weapon, Chimera, and its cure, Bellerophon. And the only way for Hunt to get to Ambrose is by teaming up with Nya Nordoff Hall. And Nya is not treated very well in this movie. I mean, the movie sets her up as this master thief. She can break into anywhere and steal anything. But then the shoe drops that the reason she's been recruited for the mission is that she's the ex-girlfriend of Sean Ambrose.
She's got no training for this kind of thing.
But to go to bed with a man and lie to him, she's a woman. She's got all the training she needs.
Bro, what? But it all leads to this weird love triangle that lies at the center of this movie, where Ethan Hunt and Sean Ambrose are both in love with the same woman. Although the idea behind Sean Ambrose is interesting, he's kind of a bizarro version of Ethan Hunt. He's impersonated Hunt a few times, knows his every move before he makes it. It serves for some pretty neat moments, like how at one point he so effortlessly bests Hunt by just anticipating all of his moves. But then, ultimately, Ambrose's whole plan revolves around unleashing Chimera to the world so that he can supply the cure, Bellerophon, all in an attempt to make a ton of money and buy stock options or whatever. I mean, once you start getting into an ultimate plot that revolves around stock options, I start tuning out because that's not very interesting. We see evil rich people do evil things all the time. I mean, come on. But despite some of the bizarre creative choices, the mistreatment of Nya, and the lack of a big, impossible sequence like the Langley heist in the first movie, there's one thing that stands out. And that's that Luther Stickle is back. Hell yeah! Ethan and Luther back together again. You'll love to see it. Oh, and the action too. Some of the action's pretty neat. And this is mainly bolstered by the fact that Tom Cruise did a lot of his own stunts for this movie, a fact that was highly publicized. The whole movie was kind of sold on the big cliffside sequence at the start, where Tom Cruise was only hooked on by a thin cord. But other than that, he's really up there. He's really climbing. He even jumps across at one point. The fact that it's real really creates this sense of stress in the audience. It's something you just can't fake, you know? And this goes for almost every stunt, from essentially free falling towards the camera before stopping mere inches above the ground, to skiing on the side of a motorcycle to evade gunfire. I mean, the last 30 minutes of this movie are probably worth the price of admission alone. I mean, everything here is absolutely crazy. Ethan Hunt is doing crazy flips left and right, cars are exploding, Tom Cruise does a nose wheelie at one point, he even rides a motorcycle through fire. It's crazy. Not to mention moments like this. And it all builds to a scene where Hunt and Ambrose do motorcycle jousting. I mean, there's really nothing like it. All of which concludes in a final fist fight between Hunt and Ambrose, featuring even more spinning and what is perhaps the scariest stunt in the entire movie. That is a real knife, being held 1/4 of an inch away from Tom Cruise's real eye. The way they pulled this off was to tie the knife on a cord held by some kind of apparatus above them so that it could only go so far. But imagine if the cord breaks, or if Tom Cruise sits up or moves at all. It's insane. It's the only thing that actually makes me squirm a little bit. Like, dude. But Tom Cruise did survive, the stunt was successful, and it's in the movie to be seen by the entire world. All of which leads to the final moment where Ethan Hunt finally takes out Sean Ambrose by kicking a gun out of the sand, spinning one more time, and shooting him in the chest. Even if this one is far from my favorite, I can totally see why someone would absolutely love this movie. But now, with the villain defeated, Hunt has completed his mission. The stock prices are probably not going to change much, and Ethan and Nya can now spend some quality time together without the burden of an impossible mission keeping them apart. And that's Mission Impossible 2. MI2 received generally positive reviews, with critics praising the action scenes, stunts, and overall fast pace, though they also stated it might be best to check your brain in at the door. As time would go on, however, MI2 would go down as perhaps the weakest of the franchise, a feeling exemplified by the fact that John Woo is the only Mission Impossible Impossible director not to be asked to return for a following installment. Despite that, MI2 was a massive financial success. Audiences were eating it up. Once again breaking records, the movie debuted on 3,600 screens, the most for any movie up to that point, making a whopping $215 million domestically and $546 million worldwide. It ultimately became the biggest movie of the summer, surpassing other box office behemoths like Gladiator and X-Men, and became the second biggest movie of the year domestically, trailing only behind Jim Carrey's The Grinch. But worldwide, Mission Impossible 2 was the biggest movie of the year, and it was not close. MI2 was bigger, badder, bolder, and to some, better than the first movie. And with its financial success, MI3 was pretty much guaranteed. The only question was, when? Turns out, it was gonna take a little while. After 2 years of nearly complete radio silence from the third Mission Impossible movie, word started to circulate that David Fincher, who'd previously directed Seven and Fight Club, was attached to take on MI3. Once more, the Mission Impossible franchise was going to go in a very different direction. New mission, new director, new style. Until eventually Fincher backed out, with plenty of quotes after the fact about some of the disadvantages of working in pre-existing franchises. With his departure, development on MI3 suddenly stalled, at least until February of 2003. Where suddenly Joe Carnahan stepped in to direct the third installment. Alright, now we're moving. The movie even tapped a screenwriter with Dean Georgaris, eyeing for release in the summer of 2004. That was until it was suddenly delayed because Tom Cruise signed on to star in Michael Mann's Collateral, meaning that MI3 was pushed back to 2005. As such, the potential pattern of a new Mission Impossible movie every 4 years was swiftly dashed. It could have been 1996, 2000, and 2004, but alas, it was not to be. But despite that delay, the machine still continued rolling into the year 2004, where Dean Georgaris was no longer attached to write. But hey, Frank Darabont was brought on board, and he's written some damn good stuff. And with him now on board and Joe Carnahan still slated to direct, the MI3 machine finally got moving. Casting news started to come through, with Carrie-Anne Moss, Kenneth Branagh, and Scarlett Johansson joining the cast, along with, of course, Ving Rhames. With production expected to begin in the summer of 2004 to make a May 2005 release. Although there were rumors that Philip Seymour Hoffman was going to be cast as the villain, but he was unable to take part due to scheduling conflicts. The film started scouting locations, particularly in Berlin, where the production even had a brief conflict with the German government in relation to a potentially pivotal location. And with filming set to begin in just a few short weeks, audiences were soon going to get their first look at MI3. Never mind, Joe Carnahan just left the project due to the ever-vague creative differences. Well, there goes another director, meaning the MI3 crew's gotta work fast to find a replacement so they can still meet the planned production start date. Immediately, a short list of names came forth, including the likes of Brett Ratner and even Frank Darabont, who was already working on the script. But neither of those two names got finalized. Because you see, one night, good old Tom Cruise was binging the TV show Alias, a TV show that was created by none other than JJ Abrams. And upon completing the first season, Tom Cruise was impressed enough with the show to immediately offer Abrams the gig to direct MI3, which would ultimately make this JJ Abrams' first feature film. Tom Cruise was taking a gamble on him, but he was confident it was going to pay off. And soon after, JJ Abrams joined with writing duo Alex Kurtzman and Roberto Orci to wipe the slate clean and create an all-new story from the ground up. But that extra time rewriting, coupled with JJ Abrams' commitments to the upcoming series Lost, meant that Mission Impossible 3 was delayed one more time, now set to release in May of 2006. And because of that schedule change, the main cast members that had already joined wound up stepping away. Carrie-Anne Moss, Scarlett Johansson, Kenneth Branagh, all gone. The only holdout was, of course, Ving Rhames. Luther Stickle's always gonna stick around. But on the upside, because of the production delay, Philip Seymour Hoffman now had an open schedule, allowing him to join the cast as the new main villain, which all led to the year 2005, where with MI3 back on the rails, the new cast began to be announced. Michelle Monaghan, Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, Kerry Russell, and Maggie Q all joined, taking on supporting roles, which all led to July 2005, where after a long and arduous arduous development cycle, a painstaking process to get something off the ground, Mission Impossible 3 had finally begun production. Things kicked off in Rome with images of a speedboat roaring through the city, a fantastic image to see on day one of production. And that great feeling continued through the rest of the shoot, which, despite the absolute mess to get to this point, the actual production on MI3 went spectacularly well. They went in with a finished script, they were always on time, and they flew all around the world to breathtaking locations. Not just the aforementioned Rome, but also Naples, before returning stateside to film across California, specifically Los Angeles, Fontana, and Calabasas, along with filming plenty of interiors at Universal Studios. All before taking a trip to China, filming in and around Shanghai to rein in the massive production effort. And ultimately, filming wrapped under budget and 2 days ahead of schedule, a stark contrast to the horrendous production of MI2. And with filming having come to a close on November 29th, 2005, it was only 2 weeks later that Paramount got the word out, as on December 12th, 2005, the first teaser trailer was released for Mission Impossible 3.
Welcome back, brother.
Oh, we are back, and I am excited. Though if you were watching this in a theater, you might not have known what this was at first, because the first half of the teaser sees Philip Seymour Hoffman's character deliver this ominous and threatening monologue. It sets a tone of dread right from the get-go, all before swiftly revealing that he's talking to Ethan Hunt, transitioning us straight into a barrage of action, explosions, effects, and of course, the classic Mission Impossible theme. It's darker, it's grittier, it looks overall a lot more grounded than especially MI2, but the word was now out there that MI3 was on its way, and the marketing efforts didn't let up as the clock turned to the year. Kicking off with the Super Bowl, unveiling a 30-second new TV spot that featured a lot of the same footage from the teaser, this time with additional looks at some of the action, stunts, and continuing to put emphasis on that one bit where Ethan Hunt gets thrown into the side of the car. That emphasis continued soon after with the full theatrical trailer, still going headfirst into a far more personal story with Ethan Hunt, and how the villain was going to threaten to burn it all down in front of him. The action looked fast-paced, the visuals looked impressive, the stunts looked great, all signs were pointing up for this third installment. And marketing didn't let up in the remaining weeks leading up to MI3's release. Posters were released with the tagline, "The mission begins," despite this being the third movie. An alternate reality online scavenger hunt was kicked off by the Super Bowl trailer, keeping fans occupied right up until the film's release. And of course, like the first two, there was going to be an original song made for MI3, this time by famous Nazi sympathizer Kanye West. Not only would he make an original song with Impossible, but there'd also be an all-new variation on the iconic Mission Impossible theme during the end credits, which all led to the film's 5 major premieres across the world. The promotional efforts for MI3 dwarfed the efforts of the first two, as Paramount was putting a lot of eggs into this basket. I mean, why not, right? MI2 was the most successful movie of 2000. It makes total sense to get the word out there that there was another one on the way, which all finally led to May 5th, 2006, where after 4 years of development issues followed by what is perhaps the smoothest production for the series, Mission Impossible 3 had hit movie theaters. It was now time to grab some popcorn, sit back, and accept the IMF's latest mission. Within the first seconds of Mission Impossible 3, this movie lets you know that you're in for a much darker ride than either of the previous two movies, as we see Ethan Hunt be interrogated by the villain Owen Davian, who's threatening to kill his wife Julia. It immediately brings the tension in full force.
Are you listening to me? The only way you're gonna get what you want is for you to... You think I'm playing? You think I'm playing? You don't think I'll do it? Where is it? Where the hell is it? Look at me. Where the hell is it? Look at me. Stay with me. 7!
But before we see the ultimate result of this scene, we flash back to a few days before, meaning we gotta build right back up to that moment. This also means that while this movie will ultimately take us on a fun ride, there's gonna be this overall looming dread, because we know where some of these pieces are gonna wind up. Until then, however, we're gonna at least have some fun. This time around, Ethan Hunt is a family man, living a happy life with his fiancée and eventual wife Julia, played by Michelle Monaghan. On top of that, Hunt has retired from active field field duty. Instead, he's a teacher instructing the next generation of IMF agents, in an IMF that is surprisingly huge. This is really the first time in these movies where we get a sense of how the IMF operates, and they're massive. Maybe they're too massive, but it definitely gives a sense of scale to this movie in particular. But eventually, when one of Hunt's former students is captured, he's brought back into the field to take down notorious black market dealer Owen Davian, who, even before we get a formal introduction to him, he continues to bring forth this feeling of dread. As during the mission to free Hunt's former student Lindsay Ferris, we realize that the villains have planted a small explosive charge into her head. And while Hunt and the others do everything in their power to stop it from going off, things don't go according to plan, which means you might want to look away.
Ethan, thank you.
This movie isn't holding back one bit, and it immediately gives Ethan Hunt the motivation to take Davian down, all of which adds up to a fast-paced, explosive, energetic, and exciting adventure that stands completely apart from the first two, while still using some of the same tricks to firmly entrench itself into the larger series. Not the least of which is the rubber face masks. While there's never really a big mask reveal like the first two, I mean there is a partial reveal later, but we do get to see the creation and application of a face mask, so that's neat, leading to a very fun sequence where Philip Seymour Hoffman gets to play as Ethan Hunt for a bit. While a stark contrast to some of the other stuff in this movie, it's entirely welcome.
What's up?
Nothing. What's up with you?
Nothing.
The direction by JJ Abrams is also welcome here. He brings an entirely new feel and approach. He's got a style unto himself. We're talking an active, fast-moving camera, we're talking whip pans, long lenses, and of course, lens flares. All of which really spices up the action. I mean, nowhere else are you going to get moments like this. There are some other aspects, like some now infamous mystery box elements, specifically in regards to the MacGuffin of the movie, and some questions about a potential mole within the IMF, but for the most part, this is a straightforward ride. This is also helped by Michael Giacchino, who, coming off of doing the music for Alias, reteams with JJ Abrams to do the score for this movie, bringing forth an exciting, orchestral, classic, and yet modern take on Mission Impossible. It's far closer in tone to the first movie's score, but it has its own themes and ideas that make it stand apart. But perhaps more significantly than any of those qualities is the fact that across his entire career, JJ Abrams has always been really good at casting. He's always bringing the right people in, people with the right energy and the right charisma, and he does it every single time. Here we have the returning players, Tom Cruise and Ving Rhames, of course, who do some great stuff in this one. Maggie Q especially stands out. She's got tons of great stuff to do, and it would be a totally welcome choice to one day bring her back. And what a performance by Philip Seymour Hoffman. He's not in the movie all that much, but within seconds you really begin to just hate this character. You want to see him taken down, which builds to a pivotal interrogation scene, a scene where, while Ethan Hunt does his best to maintain a calm demeanor the entire time, Owen Davian is in complete control from the moment he starts speaking, as he immediately threatens Julia's life.
I'm gonna make her bleed and cry and call out your name. And you're not gonna be able to do shit. You know why?
What is a rabbit's foot?
Because you're gonna be this close to dead.
And who is the buyer?
And then I'm gonna kill you right in front of her.
It's no wonder he so quickly gets under Ethan's skin. He makes for an incredibly imposing, perhaps sociopathic, and just hateful villain. It's perhaps the movie's single biggest achievement, other than the one and only Simon Pegg, who joins the cast as one Benji Dunn, who's only in the movie for a couple scenes, but he makes them count. You can always count on Simon Pegg to give a fun, lighthearted performance that contrasts nicely with the general darkness around him, and it instantly made Benji a fan favorite. But this is Mission Impossible. As great as these actors are, it's ultimately about the action, and boy is there some solid action in this movie. Firstly, the combination of practical and visual effects is astounding in this movie. There's a massive action sequence set on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge that was hardly shot on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Most of it was filmed in Calabasas on a replica of the bridge that the crew could destroy to their heart's content, all the while using clever shot choices and incredible compositing on the part of ILM to make it seem like they were really there. On top of that, during this massive action set piece, this happens. He really was thrown into that car, and combined with an explosion composited in, you really feel the impact of it. This movie boasts a consistently ingenious use of practical and visual effects. That same kind of combination is used later to great effect during a major stunt where Ethan Hunt has to jump off of a skyscraper in downtown Shanghai. A piece of the roof was built, raised roughly 50 to 60 feet in the air, and via use of green screens, the city was digitally added to the background to really make it look like Tom Cruise was actually up there. That being said, Tom Cruise did jump off, falling nearly the entire 50 to 60 feet distance towards the ground. That was really him, and that helps sell the sequence really well. There's just enough that's real in the scene to make you forget that anything in the shot is actually fake. That being said, nothing beats the real big stunt of this movie, a stunt that was entirely practical: the running scene. Tom Cruise runs a lot, in a lot of his movies. But in this movie, when the clock is ticking and Ethan Hunt needs to get somewhere fast, Tom Cruise shows off his running like no other movie of his had before. He runs through this town at full speed, the camera's tracking alongside him going at 16 miles an hour, and it just keeps going. For about 20 seconds, this movie shows nothing but Tom Cruise running. It's the single longest unbroken take of Tom Cruise running in film history. And you can tell it's real. It's genuinely thrilling. And it all leads to a final confrontation with Owen Davian, this time with Julia directly involved. Not only is it fun to see Julia get a small little action beat to cap the movie off, but a brief fist fight between Hunt and Davian winds up killing the villain in pretty gruesome fashion. Never before in this series has a villain's death been this violent and yet this satisfying. But ultimately, with the villain defeated, Julia's life is saved. Now, she and Ethan can finally go on their honeymoon, living out a nice little happy ending. While this series of films can hardly be considered a traditional trilogy, this can serve as a satisfying trilogy capper. I mean, Ethan Hunt gets a happy ending. As much as the posters and trailers said this is where the mission begins, it could honestly end here. Critical reception to MI3 was largely positive, praising the action scenes, the direction, the fast pace, but took points back for some fairly sizable logic gaps as well as criticizing the fairly empty MacGuffin.
Rabbit's foot. What is it?
Overall, critics enjoyed MI3 about the same as they had the first two, if not perhaps a tiny bit less, with some calling it more of the same. And that general lack of outward enthusiasm might have had an impact on the box office. Kicking off the summer movie season of 2006, MI3 opened with $48 million domestically, about $10 million shy of MI2's opening weekend. And over the summer, MI3 continued to fall short of its predecessors, making $134 million domestically and $398 million worldwide. While those numbers are nothing to sneeze at, MI3 was the lowest grossing of the series, which began to raise questions regarding both the franchise's future and Tom Cruise's future as an action star. Were audiences getting sick of Tom Cruise? Was this actually going to be the end for Mission Impossible? Surprisingly enough, it wasn't just audiences that were asking these kinds of questions, because a few months after MI3's release, Paramount and Tom Cruise had a very public, very messy blowout that resulted in the two sides parting ways. After 14 years of Tom Cruise working directly with Paramount, their partnership had come to a sudden end. Now, this wasn't just because of the seemingly disappointing MI3 box office, but more due to Cruise's public behavior over the last few years, including events like him jumping on the couch on Oprah to profess his love for Katie Holmes, being far more open about his devotion to Scientology, as well as some press regarding his disapproval of prescription drugs. All of it was beginning to run counter to Paramount's ideals, resulting in the two splitting on less than amicable terms. It was certainly a blow to the public perception of Tom Cruise, and Paramount even planned to move on without him, with rumors spelling out quite quickly that Brad Pitt might take over the Mission Impossible franchise. And in the years that followed, Tom Cruise's career would go through an awkward stage. Eventually, longtime producing partner Paula Wagner would step down, leaving Cruise as a sole producer on his future projects. Movies like Valkyrie and Lions for Lambs were far from box office hits. In fact, Cruise's most successful outing at this time was his appearance as Les Grossman in Tropic Thunder. But all things that go down must come back up, because despite this recent downturn, strides were made to get things back on track, which led to the year After the success of JJ Abrams' Star Trek reboot, both he and Tom Cruise reteamed to finally begin work on Mission Impossible 4. JJ Abrams would only produce this time, however, as he was already beginning to prep for his Star Trek sequel. This was followed shortly after by the hiring of 2 writers, Josh Applebaum and Andrei Nemec, to pen the script, both of whom had written for JJ Abrams' Alias, and would now be working on a story created by Abrams and Cruise for MI4. But even with Tom Cruise on board as a producer, the question was still raised. Will he still star in the movie as Ethan Hunt? Well, that question was finally answered in the early months of... where 3.5 years after their messy breakup, Tom Cruise and Paramount had finally reunited, meaning that Tom Cruise was in fact going to return as Ethan Hunt. It was a big move to be sure, a pretty hefty gamble, as Tom Cruise wasn't quite the same name as he was when even the 3rd movie came out, as the underwhelming release of his latest movie, Night and Day, made perfectly clear. But with him officially on board, it was now time to find a director. A handful of names popped up, including Ruben Fleischer, director of Zombieland, and even Edgar Wright at one point. But ultimately, in a rather unexpected move, the role of the director fell into the hands of one Brad Bird, who up until now had never directed a live-action movie. But his tenure in animation made a fantastic resume. I mean, The Iron Giant, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, like, come on. Yet again, Mission Impossible was going for a completely different look and feel than what had been done before. But because it took so long to find a director, the movie's release was pushed back from its planned May 2011 release to instead debut in December of 2011. For the first time, Mission Impossible wasn't gonna swing into the summer movie season. But the summer was already getting a little crowded, so perhaps it was a good thing to move to the less densely packed Christmas season. But now, with Brad Bird involved, casting was underway. Immediately, Simon Pegg was tapped to return as Benji Dunn, taking the number of returning cast members all the way up to 3. The other 2, of course, being Tom Cruise and Ving Rhames. The latter, Ving Rhames, was slated to have a significant role in MI4, but reported budget cuts might have ultimately removed him from the story, meaning the tenure of Luther Stickle might actually come to an end. Despite that, the 4th installment started bustling with all new talent, including Paula Patton, Vladimir Mashkov, Michael Nyqvist, Josh Holloway, and of course, Jeremy Renner. Jeremy Renner, in fact, was reported to be getting set up as the new face of Mission Impossible. It seemed that despite trusting Tom Cruise to headline another movie, moves were still made to perhaps say goodbye to Ethan Hunt. Eventually, however, production on MI4 finally began in the fall of 2010 in Prague, returning to where the first film shot all those years ago. And this was followed by word that Mission Impossible 4 might not be called Mission Impossible 4. For the first time, the series was going to dawn an all-new title. Some even speculated that the Mission Impossible part of the title was going to be dropped, but those fears were misplaced, as eventually, at the tail end of October, the title was officially revealed as Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. All signs were pointing to this entry being something of a reboot for the series. Why have the burden of the number 4 on the title when a subtitle makes it seem like this is somewhat a fresh start? But as eye-catching as that might have been, there was one event that really got people's attention towards the end of the year. Because in November of 2010, production turned to the city of Dubai, most specifically the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world. I mean, cool, right? They're filming at the tallest building in the world. But people likely wouldn't see much about that yet. They'd likely film some interior shots, maybe you'd see a film crew in the lobby, but nothing all that exciting. That was what was expected anyway, because instead what people saw was Tom Cruise dangling from the outside of the building. In perhaps one of the most publicized stunts of the series, Tom Cruise was going to perform a sequence hanging from the side of the tallest building in the world. Opinions immediately started to shift as a collective, "Wait, what?" washed over audiences. Perhaps some good faith could be restored in the franchise. Good faith the production hoped to continue as the clock turned to the year where over New Year's production moved up to Canada, specifically Vancouver, for the last major chunk of shooting, filming in the city streets that were dressed to look like a city in India, as well as redecorating Granville Island to fill in for a scene set in Seattle. The production made big moves over the city, all before principal photography came to a close on March 19th, 2011, followed by a couple reports of second unit filming in Mumbai. Overall, it was a hugely publicized production, generating a lot of conversation. And now, with filming having wrapped, it was time to generate even more conversation, which started in March with a special press eyes only showcase of some of Paramount's biggest upcoming movies, including the likes of JJ Abrams' Super 8, Michael Bay's Transformers Dark of the Moon, and of course, Brad Bird's Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. While none of this footage was made public, there was plenty of talk around the pivotal sequence around the Burj Khalifa. Audiences could only imagine what it would look like on the big screen. But they didn't have to imagine much longer, as finally, at the tail end of June, debuting before Transformers Dark of the Moon in theaters, audiences finally got their first look at Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol.
An hour ago, a bomb blew up the Kremlin. The president has initiated Ghost Protocol. The entire IMF has been disavowed.
Immediately setting the stakes for the story, this teaser sees the entire IMF be taken down, leaving only a small team of agents to take on a plot bigger than any other before it. Mixing that in with callbacks and catchphrases from both the TV show and the previous movies, as well as a fast, quick-cut montage of action and spectacle, this teaser immediately made an impression, even building up Jeremy Renner's character, supporting the reports that he might take over the franchise going forward. But while all of that was fun, while it all looked like a solid action movie, it was merely a precursor to the real showstopper, which the trailer teased right at the very end.
You're not gonna make it!
You're not helping.
Within 15 seconds, this movie snatched the attention of audiences around the world. Mission Impossible 3 might have been a disappointment to some, but Ghost Protocol was going to be a fresh start, and excitement for it only built from here. Because as the summer went on, promotion for Ghost Protocol continued with some exclusive images, a teaser poster, and word that the movie would debut fully on December 21st. But if you wanted to see it a bit sooner, the movie would debut 5 days earlier on December 16th in IMAX. I mean, come on, you saw that Burj sequence. Getting to see that early and on the biggest screens around? I'm there, dude. All of which led to the debut of a second theatrical trailer at the end of October. While largely the same as the first trailer, it lightened up the tone a little bit, sold some more of the action, revealed a little bit more of the story, and of course, it revealed a little bit more of the Burj Khalifa. The excitement was in full force now, as in the remaining 2 months until release, screens were inundated with TV spots, posters, and all sorts of other ads presenting this as the must-see movie to cap off the year. Not to mention the fact that IMAX screenings of Ghost Protocol would also feature a 6-minute preview for The Dark Knight Rises. That's just icing on the cake, honestly. Promotion was in full swing and audiences were eating it up. Despite the disappointment of the previous entry, Mission Impossible was back. All of which finally led to December 16th, 2011, where internationally and in IMAX, the fourth film in Tom Cruise's spy series finally hit theaters. After 5.5 years away, after plenty of bad press surrounding Cruise, Mission Impossible had stormed back into theaters to wow audiences all over again. It was now time to accept a new mission, to take on an all-new adventure with the IMF. Whoops, sorry, the IMF is gone, actually. Sorry about that. After a mission gone wrong resulted in a devastating explosion at the Kremlin, the president had no choice but to initiate Ghost Protocol. As such, Ethan Hunt, Benji Dunn, Jane Carter, and William Branch are the only 4 remaining agents of the IMF, and as such are the only ones capable of stopping the villain codenamed Cobalt from launching a nuclear missile at the United States and starting nuclear war. Together, with the help of the only gadgets at their disposal, they gotta get the nuclear launch codes, defeat Cobalt, take down an assassin, have fun while they're doing it, all within a clean, concise 2-hour adventure. And boy, do they succeed in spades. Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol is a thrill ride from start to finish. Kicking off with a fun, lighthearted prison break, this movie immediately sets itself apart from its predecessors. As much as Mission Impossible 3 went a long way to try and humanize Ethan Hunt, this movie succeeds with seemingly half the effort, on top of pairing him with a top-notch team of agents. I mean, it's a blast to see Benji Dunn again. Simon Pegg kills it like always. Jane Carter is an incredibly welcome addition, and she gets a lot to do in this movie. Having suffered the loss of Trevor Hannaway at the start of the movie to an assassin, she's on a partial quest for revenge. And William Brandt is a fun addition here as well. And as potentially eye-rolly as it might be to see him forced into becoming the new Ethan Hunt, this movie really only hints towards that outcome. And those hints are kind of fun. I mean, he's asking Hunt questions, trying to understand how he operates. He feels very reminiscent of Hunt from the first movie. He's even got the same haircut, kinda. Which naturally makes Ethan Hunt the senior operative on this mission. You know, in the previous ones, one might feel that Ethan Hunt hadn't quite come into his own yet. He was still learning, he hadn't quite figured out the ropes. But here, Ethan Hunt is confident, clear, he's definitely the leader of this team. And it's nice to see that evolution, especially since he started as part of a larger team in the first movie. But despite those ties back to the previous 3 movies, this one stands entirely on its own. You can jump into this one without having seen a single Mission Impossible movie, and you'll still have a great time. This is largely thanks to director Brad Bird, who takes his animation chops to live action to create a thrilling adventure. His action direction is clear, concise, as well as having that kind of animated flair that you rarely see in live action. At the same time, the pacing of this movie is relentless. Once it hits the ground, it's running until the credits roll. That might sound exhausting, but the pace of direction and editing done by Paul Hirsch give this a rhythm that makes that pace exhilarating. All of which is personified in the moment when Ethan Hunt tries to outrun a sandstorm, one of the movie's single best images. But one of the more ingenious things Brad Bird brought to the table was that since the IMF technically no longer existed, machinery and equipment would naturally stop working. This is evidenced right off the bat with the traditional mission dossier, which normally after it delivers its message, it would self-destruct after 5 seconds. But here, on top of that, this movie only contains a singular tearaway mask reveal, mainly because when the agents try and create their own for a part of the mission, the machine breaks, meaning they have to improvise. But nowhere is this theme of malfunctioning equipment more terrifying than in the most pivotal sequence of the movie. The main reason anyone paid the price of admission, the sequence on the Burj Khalifa. It is here that Hunt is given special adhesive gloves that can help him hang off the side of the building, gripping him on tight. This is already terrifying, similarly to how the climbing stunt in MI2 was terrifying. Tom Cruise is really up there, he's really on the side of the building. While in reality he's hooked to cables, that doesn't change the fact that he's still higher than the top of the Empire State Building. Which gives this scene a sense of tension that cannot be faked, because you're so completely aware that that distance to the ground is real. You're gripping onto your seat as hard as you can, and you'll definitely start gripping even tighter when... Oh man, of course one of the gloves stops working. Of course, man. I mean, what a way to create tension, eliminating one of the security blankets. And it all builds to a big crescendo where Hunt is suddenly dangling from a cable, running down the side of the building. It's genuinely one of the most breathtaking action sequences ever put to the big screen. And it's not even all that action-packed. It gets by purely on the adrenaline of being at those heights, knowing that it's all real, and knowing that it can go wrong at any moment. This is good stuff. But even with all the malfunctioning equipment, there is one piece of technology that does work properly, and that's this really cool fake hallway imager thing. Once again, following in the footsteps of the first movie, this one utilizes the lack of sound in a great way, as Hunt and Benji have to slowly sneak closer and closer to this guard, who can't see them because of the really cool hollow wall thing, but they still gotta be quiet. Oh, and they also can't stand in front of the camera. Another aspect that works really well is the music. For the first time in this series, a composer came back to score a second movie, and that was Michael Giacchino, the man behind the music of MI3. Here he takes the best aspects of that score, including some of those themes, and combines it with all new material, specifically giving each location a distinct musical sound. As different as these places all look, it's great to also hear that difference musically. And all of this winds up building to a massive standoff between Hunt and Cobalt in this incredible automatic parking structure. I think it's really interesting that even though the Burj Khalifa sequence is the selling point of the movie, it's not the climax. Instead, the climax is a smaller, more mano-a-mano kind of fight. I mean, I say smaller, but the logistics of setting it in this kind of structure are still absolutely massive, and it makes the visuals of the sequence all the more interesting. Combine that with more action with the rest of the team, a ticking clock because Cobalt has launched the nuclear missile, and you've got a tense, all-or-nothing finale that leaves your palms 10 times sweatier than when the scene started. But it ultimately results in every single member of the team pitching in to finally stop the missile. You know what makes that part even better? Ethan Hunt actually says, "Mission accomplished!" You gotta love that. But there's one pivotal aspect to this movie that I really like. It's not an action thing, it's a relatively small character and story thing. Because Brandt, as it turns out, was once a field agent for the IMF, but he retired from field work after his last mission went wrong. He was tasked with protecting Ethan Hunt and his wife Julia. That's right, the same Julia from MI3. Although things went wrong and Julia wound up dead. Yeah, kind of an unceremonious end for that character, but it gives Brandt and Hunt a kind of silent, unspoken conflict throughout the movie, as Brandt has to stand face to face with the man he failed. But after their mission is successful and the IMF is restored, Hunt reveals to him the real story, that as long as Ethan and Julia were together, Julia would never be safe. As such, her death was actually faked, and Ethan Hunt was sent to prison to start looking into Cobalt, which is where we find him at the start of the movie. It's a nice little scene that resolves a very central conflict in this movie, and it also brings a heartfelt scene where, once Ethan Hunt is alone, he sees Julia alive and well across the pier. She knows he's out there, he knows she's alive, and they can both live out their lives to the best that they can. As such, this movie becomes the first in the series to really commit to long-term continuity. As much as this movie stands on its own, it is also built up from the ground laid by the first three, which is really nice to see considering that outside of returning players Ethan Hunt and Luther Stickle, the previous movies were all pretty much standalone adventures. But I know what you're thinking, and I know what you're thinking is making you worried, but let me put those worries to rest. Luther Stickle does make an appearance in this movie right at the very end, keeping the streak alive. You'll love to see it. And now, as Ethan Hunt walks into the smoke to take on an all-new mission, we close the curtain on Ghost Protocol. Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol was a massive critical and financial success. Many critics praised the action, Brad Bird's direction, fun performances from all of the cast, and especially the Burj Khalifa sequence, which proved to be mind-blowing on IMAX screens. And across its theatrical run, Ghost Protocol made a whopping $209 million domestically and $694 million worldwide. As such, Ghost Protocol became the most successful film of the series, far exceeding the box office takes of the previous three. This was in part thanks to its release timing, as there wasn't much competition in the month of January. But regardless, this was hailed as not just one of the best action movies of the year, but one of the best movies of the year. And thanks to its immense success, critics and audiences managed to universally agree on one thing. Mission Impossible had finally figured out what it wanted to be. identity. The series had finally carved out its own niche. It was no longer in the shadow of other franchises like James Bond or the Bourne films. Mission Impossible was now one of the heavy hitters. And as such, fans, audiences, and critics alike were more excited than ever for a 5th installment. Because if it's anything like this, we're gonna have a hell of a fun time. As the dust settled following the success of Ghost Protocol, one more thing became clear to critics and audiences. While there were plenty of reports and moves made to eventually replace Tom Cruise as the lead of the franchise, the fact that this latest installment wasn't just the most successful of the franchise, but also the most successful movie of Tom Cruise's career up to this point, managed to squash those plans entirely. As much as Jeremy Renner would likely remain on board for future installments, Tom Cruise and Ethan Hunt weren't going anywhere. As such, the machine immediately started moving to set the stage for Mission Impossible 5. The only downside was that Brad Bird ultimately turned down the offer to return, stating that part of the series' charm was that every movie was helmed by a different person, and felt that it'd be best to continue that streak going into Mission 5. As such, the director's search eventually narrowed down to the one and only Christopher McQuarrie, whose previous efforts included screenwriting The Usual Suspects and his own directorial debut, The Way of the Gun. On top of that, he'd even collaborated with Tom Cruise a couple times, writing the 2008 movie Valkyrie, as well as directing Cruise in 2012's Jack Reacher. On top of that, Christopher McQuarrie also had some involvement on Ghost Protocol. You see, partway through filming, he was brought in to help rework the script, because the filmmakers were running into one roadblock after another. Some of the changes implemented by McQuarrie included additional clarity when it came to the Burj Khalifa sequence, why all of the characters were there, why they mattered, and the consequences if things went wrong. On top of that, the original plan for Julia was that she was really going to be dead. But to give the audience some emotional relief by the end of the movie, McQuarrie helped bring about the new ending that Julia is actually alive, serving as both relief for the audience and for Agent Brandt, which honestly makes for the best ending of the series so far. All in all, Tom Cruise and Christopher McQuarrie already had a solid working relationship up to this point, which ultimately made the choice to give him the reins on Mission 5 a no-brainer. As such, the machine trucked on forward into the year 2013, where Drew Pearce was hired to take on screenwriting duties, having just come off the success of Iron Man 3, which he co-wrote. This was followed by confirmation that Simon Pegg would once again step into the shoes of Benji Dunn, and eventually the 5th film set its release date for Christmas Day 2015. Following in the footsteps of Ghost Protocol, Mission Impossible was once again gonna take over the Christmas season. Well, actually this time it'd be met with some stiff competition, as it would be releasing 1 week after the highly anticipated 7th episode of Star Wars. It's got an uphill battle to climb, but if the last one was any indication, I'm sure people will tune in once more. And following that, pre-production continued into the year 2014. It was here that another screenwriter came on board, this time Will Staples, who was set to take over from Drew Pearce. But that stint didn't last long, as at a certain point, Christopher McQuarrie himself took over screenwriting duties. Now, with him in both the writing and directing chair, casting news was finally afoot. Firstly, it was rumored that Jessica Chastain might join the film as the new female lead, but that eventually fell through. But hey, guess what? Jeremy Renner was officially confirmed to return. Look at that, the list of returning characters in this series is expanding exponentially. Next you're gonna tell me Ving Rhames is coming back. Oh, look at that, Ving Rhames is coming back. Luther Stickle, the franchise's lucky man, was gonna be back. This time in a major capacity, not just a cameo appearance. This was followed up by newcomers Alec Baldwin as the head of the CIA, and Rebecca Ferguson as the new female lead beside Tom Cruise, all of which built to the start of production in August of 2014, where, after seemingly no time since the release of Ghost Protocol, another Mission Impossible was underway. Kicking off in Vienna with some rooftop stunts before heading over to Morocco, where Tom Cruise and Simon Pegg were seen filming a car chase, all before spending a large chunk of time up in London to capture plenty of the sequences for this 5th installment. Production was flying across the world at a seemingly record pace, but the actual process to put it together was quite improvisational. You see, it might be reasonable to assume that to make a movie, you nail down the script first, and then you cast actors for the roles, and then you shoot the movie. But that's not really how a Mission Impossible movie comes together. The system employed by Tom Cruise and Christopher McQuarrie relied far more on figuring it out as they went along. They of course mapped out some of the big sequences, as those take the longest time to prep and film, but the smaller dialogue scenes were put together as a result of what they figured out on those big sequences. Character motivations, plot devices, the specifics of what certain characters were after were laid in place as they were filming. It's a daunting prospect, writing the movie as you're going, but it actually helps build an incredibly cooperative atmosphere, as each of the actors have a say in where their characters might wind up going and how they impact the story. And as production went on, new cast members joined, particularly Simon McBurney as well as Sean Harris, the latter of whom being set to play the film's main villain. And the images that were coming out from production were also incredibly exciting. You know, ever since the Burj Khalifa sequence, fans were asking how could MI5 possibly top it? How could they possibly hope to even compete with it? Oh, I'll tell you how. You strap Tom Cruise to the side of an Airbus A400 and you fly away with him hanging on from the outside. Why not, right? I mean, come on. As much as you might want to question the sanity, it's hard to question the results. As images of this popped up all over the internet, audiences suddenly got their first taste of how MI5 was going to up the ante. Too bad they'd have to wait all the way until Christmas 2015 to see it on the big screen for themselves. Although, maybe that was going to change, as massive news broke in the early months of 2015, where quite suddenly the release date of the movie changed. Now, given the precedent set by the last four, you might expect it to have been pushed back. Summer 2016, Christmas 2016? Well, no. Because instead, Christmas was coming early as Mission Impossible 5 was suddenly bumped up 5 months early, now set for release on July 31st, 2015. Mainly because it was foolish to try and compete with Star Wars, which was already taking up a lot of publicity, but also because it allowed MI5 to debut on IMAX screens. While there weren't any IMAX-specific scenes this time, there's still no beating the biggest screens around. But despite this sudden and exciting move, the production hit one last snag right before its end, as it was reported that production halted for about a week to, quote, fix the ending. For whatever reason, the original ending put in place wasn't up to snuff. But as worrying as this late stop might be, some actually considered it a bit of a confidence booster. You know, some other filmmakers might come across debilitating problems with their endings and decide to keep pushing forward anyway. But here, Christopher McQuarrie, Tom Cruise, and a third unknown writer were going to take a little extra time and get it right. Confidence was also boosted by the fact that 2014's Edge of Tomorrow, also starring Tom Cruise, went through a similar mid-production rewriting phase, and that movie turned out awesome, so. Regardless, production was swiftly back on for its final stretch as it eventually came to a close on March 12th, 2015. As such, with the July release looming and no time to waste, it was time to get the word out on Mission Impossible 5, kicking off on March 22nd with a full minute-long TV spot.
I want you to choose your next words very carefully. Where is Hunt?
We've never met before, right?
Across 60 seconds, this little teaser displays some incredible imagery, some teases of the action, some hints towards the story, coupled with great little moments between Ethan and Benji, as well as the spotlight new character played by Rebecca Ferguson. And perhaps most significantly, this spot closes out with the official reveal of the title. Oh boy, I am ready to jump back in with the IMF, and good thing too, as this was immediately followed up with a full 2.5-minute trailer the next day. It expands on what was seen in the teaser, whilst also showing incredible glimpses at some of the new stunts on display, as well as a little bit of humor.
You have your seatbelt on? You asking me that now?
Oh, hey boys, what did I miss?
But the real showstopper comes right at the end, where, after teasing some of the incredible looking action scenes, the trailer comes to a close with the Mission Impossible sequence to end all Mission Impossible sequences.
Open the door! Yeah, I'm trying. Oh my God!
Alright, I'm hooked. I'm gonna buy my tickets now if that's alright, because I am 100% on board for this. And excitement only built from there, because as the clock turned to June, marketing continued with a second full trailer, featuring plenty of familiar footage, further glimpses at the villains of the movie, the Syndicate, heavily marketed as an anti-IMF, and of course, a little bit more of that plane stunt. But what this new trailer shows off more of is a sequence where Ethan Hunt is underwater and racing against the clock. The ultimate resolution isn't revealed in the trailer, but it goes to show that this movie's not going to hold anything back on any of the sequences. As much as the plane stunt might be the reason we all go see the movie, the rest of it's going to knock our socks off too.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Are you okay to drive? I mean, a minute ago you were dead.
What are you talking about?
This is not going to end well.
This was followed up a few weeks later with an all-new Payoff trailer, showing off more footage, more action, getting fans and audiences everywhere ready for this late addition to a monstrous summer movie season. TV spots continued the excitement as promotion built and built, putting this film on as many people's radars as possible, which all led to July 31st, 2015, where after 3.5 years since Ghost Protocol shot the franchise with a much-needed dose of adrenaline, Rogue Nation had finally arrived. It was the shortest gap yet between two Mission Impossible films, and audiences were more ready than ever to jump on over to theaters for the return of the IMF. From the moment the opening logos end to the moment the credits roll, this movie is in a full sprint. Nowhere is that more personified than in this movie's introduction of Ethan Hunt, who storms into the cold open, sprinting, all before eventually latching himself to the side of an Airbus A400. That's right, the movie's most marketed, most talked about sequence happens before the opening titles. It was really just a, hey, this sounds fun, let's make it the opening kind of choice. But boy, is it awesome. I mean, he's really up there, and you can see it, especially in the moment where the plane finally takes off from the ground and Tom Cruise, or Ethan Hunt, can't keep his feet plastered to the ground. I mean, it's the little moments like that that really sell it. But despite being an unexpected turn, putting this scene at the start makes one thing clear. This sequence, while the film's most visually stunning, is really only the tip of the iceberg. This time around, after a series of catastrophic events linked directly to the IMF, you know, the events of the previous 4 movies, the IMF is suddenly shut down. Not disavowed, this isn't Ghost Protocol again, the IMF is gone. For good. And now, Ethan Hunt is on his own to track down Solomon Lane, the head of a secretive terrorist group known as the Syndicate, or as Benji refers to them,
an anti-IMF.
Working off the grid, Ethan Hunt, as well as Benji Dunn, must stop the Syndicate whilst being hunted by the CIA, led by director Hunley. At the same time, William Brandt teams up with Luther Stickle, you know, a real odd couple situation, to track down Hunt before the CIA can reach him. All of which amounts to another 2-hour roller coaster that's thrilling from start to finish. Once again, following in the footsteps of Ghost Protocol, Mission Impossible knocks it out of the park. It's fun, it's fast, the action is intense, it looks amazing, and more than any of the other movies, this one's really funny. I mean, take this moment where, partway through the movie, after Brandt and Luther have been tracking down Hunt and Benji for like 30 minutes, they find themselves in Morocco where this happens. It's such an unexpected payoff to that subplot, but it results in some big laughs. This incredible management of tone comes from not quite series newcomer Christopher McQuarrie, who takes the directorial stamps of all of the previous directors to form an all-new feel for this new installment. The action is still crystal clear, but there's a gruffness, a grit. Each punch hits harder than the last. This movie relies quite a bit on hand-to-hand combat, and nowhere is that more prominent than in the massive opera sequence. Not only are the visuals and music incredible, but it's spinning so many plates at once, which is incredibly difficult. I mean, it'd be so easy for the sequence to get lost in its own tangled web, but there's a clarity with the geography. You know where everyone is at all times, so you always have a read on the scene. It's an aspect that seems so deceptively simple, but it's immensely difficult to pull off, but it makes all the difference. But perhaps the movie's standout sequence is in the middle of the movie, where, in order to steal a vital piece of documentation, Ethan Hunt must dive into a water-cooled security system and switch switch out one of the security profiles. The wrinkle? He can't use an oxygen tank, meaning he has to hold his breath the entire time he's underwater while simultaneously exerting himself physically to switch out the profiles. Add on to that the fact that there is moving equipment inside and you have yourself a heart-poundingly tense sequence. It's not just that Hunt's on the clock, it's that he can't breathe, meaning the audience is subconsciously also holding their breath. They're right there with him, which is also helped by the fact that Tom Cruise actually filmed these long takes underwater. In fact, he can actually hold his breath underwater for 6 minutes, which just adds even more to the sequence, knowing that he's actually the one performing this underwater. Again, it's the kind of stuff you just can't fake, and the ultimate reaction from the audience coming out of it is all the better for it. The score in this movie is also really good, this time composed by Joe Kramer. He brings a healthy mixture of classic and yet modern sensibilities. The score is very orchestral, there's a lot of emphasis on horns, but it's also quite heavy on the bass, particularly with the theme for the Syndicate. On top of that, the score makes the ingenious move of consistently working in the Mission Impossible theme. In prior installments, the theme might show up at the start, at the end, and maybe one sequence in the middle, but here some of those major chords are plastered all over this movie. From big reveals like this movie's 2 mask reveals to the tense action sequences, it is the theme, and this movie knows it. But perhaps the most inspired choice made by this movie is the introduction of one Ilsa Faust, played by Rebecca Ferguson. Within seconds of her introduction, she immediately becomes a fun foil for Ethan Hunt. On top of that, she has her own motivations clouded by the larger conspiracy at hand, which gives her character and the movie a whole new dimension to play with. She's never overly sexualized, she's an integral part to the story, and best of all, she can kick ass like no other. It's amazing how well this character came together, considering that it was one of those aforementioned figure it out as we go along aspects of this movie. Because at a certain point during production, it was realized that the pivotal motorcycle chase in the middle of the movie became way more interesting if it turned out Ethan was chasing Ilsa instead of the main villain. As a result, there now needed to be a reason for Ilsa to turn against Ethan, and so this entire tangled web was added, where she had to answer to both Chief Atlee of MI6, who wants her as an undercover operative for Solomon Lane, who wants her to help him take down Ethan Hunt. A simple choice, a not so simple solution, and yet by the end of it all, the character is not only one of the most interesting aspects of the movie, but she almost steals the show from Ethan Hunt. The villain, Solomon Lane, is also great in this. Sean Harris plays him as this very cold, very calculating character. He never raises his voice, which makes it feel like he's in complete control from the moment he's introduced. The movie goes a long way to set this guy up as Ethan Hunt's ultimate foil, which brings us to what is perhaps my favorite aspect of this movie, Ethan Hunt himself. Now, throughout this series, Ethan Hunt's always been a pretty fun character, but with the exception of MI3, there hasn't been a lot to him. He's really only carried by the seemingly effortless charisma of Tom Cruise, and believe me, that carries it a long way. But here, this movie gives him a piece of characterization that makes him stand out in the sea of spy heroes, because in this movie, Ethan Hunt is crazy. Now, stay with me, because this is a good thing. Throughout this series, we've gotten hints that Ethan Hunt can never turn off the spy part of himself. He just loves this too much. But here, it becomes something of an obsession. He has to take down Lane. He has to stop the Syndicate. It's like it's his life's mission, which makes Lane's seeming invincibility all the more devastating. And I think Hunt's craziness here is best exemplified during the massive 30-minute stretch of action in the middle of the movie. Following the underwater heist, Hunt's heart actually stops, until of course he's revived with a defibrillator. But you might think, man, this guy's had a tough day. He technically died. It's time for a rest. But no, Ethan Hunt immediately finds himself in a high-speed car chase through the streets of Casablanca. But if that's not enough, once the car chase ends in a horrific accident, Hunt swiftly gets on a motorcycle to continue the high-speed chase. I mean, he's crazy. And this movie is all the more fun for it, which ultimately builds to a massive monologue given by director Hunley before the movie's climax, which takes all of these crazy antics and puts it into words, creating what is perhaps one of the hardest lines in cinema history.
He has most likely anticipated this very conversation and is waiting to strike in whatever direction we move. Sir, Hunt is the living manifestation of destiny, and he has made you his mission.
Hunt is the living manifestation of destiny? I mean, come on, dude. That's awesome. and it all builds into the ultimate climax of the movie, which, surprisingly, isn't all that big of a climax. You know, most movies in this genre or of this scale would always be escalating. You start with something small and build up to something big. That's just what makes the most sense, right? But this movie makes the interesting choice to start with the biggest and flashiest sequence, the plane stunt, and end with a climax where Ethan Hunt remembers a series of numbers. What this movie does do, however, is raise the personal stakes, as Benji's life is in danger during this finale, and that stokes fear right into our core. We like Benji, we don't want to see him go, but ultimately Benji does survive, leading to a final foot chase, a little hand-to-hand combat, and finally a face-to-face meeting between Hunt and Lane. And this is where those last-minute rewrites came into play, as the original ending to this movie might have seen Lane get killed, presumably by Ethan Hunt, but the longer things went on, the more the filmmakers became aware that that conclusion never quite felt right. So instead, mirroring a scene earlier in the movie, Hunt, Benji, Luther, Ilsa, and Brant all trap Lane in a glass box.
Gentlemen, this is Solomon Lane. Mr. Lane, meet the IMF.
And this is why we need the IMF. This is why this agency exists, because of this team. God, it's so good. And ultimately, with Lane captured, the IMF is officially reinstated, with Hunley as the new secretary.
Welcome to the IMF, Mr. Secretary.
And that's Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. Critical reception to this 5th installment was incredibly positive. In fact, if it weren't for Mad Max Fury Road releasing the same summer, it might have been hailed as the greatest action movie of 2015. Critics cited the performances, set piece, and surprising humor as some of the film's best qualities. And audiences responded in kind, as following in Ghost Protocol's footsteps, Rogue Nation became another massive hit, taking all it could in the last weeks of the summer movie season, garnering an impressive $195 million domestically and a spectacular $682 million worldwide. While falling mildly short of its predecessor, it showed that Mission Impossible was a truly unique franchise. Unique in the sense that, weirdly enough, it was getting better the longer it went on. It seemed impossible to catch lightning in a bottle twice, but it happened, and Rogue Nation was a huge success. As such, audiences were waiting on the edge of their seats for when lightning would be caught for a third time. And faster than any franchise installment before it, the machine immediately started rolling on Mission Impossible 6. In fact, word circulated so fast that Tom Cruise announced that they'd make a sequel 2 days before Rogue Nation even came out, so... And following that, in record pace, the 6th installment search for a director had also come to a close. A close that would actually buck tradition. You see, each Mission Impossible movie up to this point has featured a different director, each with their own distinct visual style and sensibilities. But now, for the first time in the series, someone was going to come back. And it was none other than Christopher McQuarrie. That's right, the man behind Rogue Nation was coming back for the 6th installment. Clearly there was a winning formula at play with the partnership between Cruise and McQuarrie, and what better way to continue making good stuff than to reteam for the next adventure. And what else can you do to help solidify that winning formula? Bring back Rebecca Ferguson as Ilsa Faust. Much to the excitement of fans, she was the first confirmed returning member of the MI6 cast, and the first female lead to take on a significant role in 2 Mission Impossible movies, which all led to the year 2016, where the original Mission Impossible movie celebrated its 20th anniversary, with plenty of articles coming out celebrating its release and the still ongoing series it spawned. Unfortunately though, there wasn't much news to cover on the next installment itself, as Tom Cruise spent most of the year working on the Jack Reacher sequel and the Mummy reboot. But towards the end of the year, news did come forth, as pre-production was suddenly halted due to contract disputes. Yeah, there were disagreements about how much money Tom Cruise was gonna make, yada yada, it's a bunch of weird Hollywood accounting stuff. But ultimately, it all wrapped up nice and neatly, and pre-production continued right into the year 2017, where in lead up to the spring production start, casting news was abound, starting with the new additions Vanessa Kirby and, perhaps most publicized of all, Henry Cavill. And this was followed by the announcement of all of the returning players, including the already confirmed Rebecca Ferguson, as well as Simon Pegg, Alec Baldwin, Sean Harris, the villain of the last movie, interesting enough, and of course, Ving Rhames. But there was one person missing from this returning crowd, and that was Jeremy Renner. And kind of an unfortunate turn, seeing as he was brought in for Ghost Protocol to potentially take over for Tom Cruise. But now, largely due to his schedule being jam-packed by the upcoming Avengers duology, he was no longer going to be involved in Mission Impossible. Now, this doesn't discount a return entirely, but after 2 bouts as Agent Brandt, he was going to take a back seat this time around. In any case, MI6 got off the ground running, as in April of 2017, production kicked off in Paris. Beginning with a bang, as on one of the first days of production, people caught a glimpse of Tom Cruise getting thrown off of a motorcycle. Plenty more stunts were seen across the city streets, as the 6th installment spent a lot of time in Paris filming some of the movie's biggest action set pieces, all before taking the jump down to New Zealand, where the cast wound up expanding even further, adding Angela Bassett as the new director of the CIA and Michelle Monaghan? Turns out the next adventure for the IMF was going to bring back one of the series' most important characters. Even after it seemed that that story was over in Ghost Protocol, it looked like there was going to be a little bit more. Eventually, with a couple group shots released as production concluded in New Zealand, the film headed north to London for some more action. Some of it was even caught on camera, like this clip. You know, this one's been going around a lot lately. Let's check it out. Yeah, that looks like what you think it looks like. During the production on MI6 in London, Tom Cruise wound up breaking his ankle during one of his many stunts. Ultimately, production had to be delayed, or rather reorganized, to allow Tom Cruise time to recover. But the story surrounding the actual stunt is pretty neat, as Christopher McQuarrie said in interviews shortly after that Tom Cruise knew the instant he hit the wall that his ankle was broken, but still completed the shot and exited frame as planned before calling it quits. I mean, that's crazy, right? You break your ankle and you still power through and finish the shot? I mean, it's no wonder that McQuarrie would later make it very clear that he was going to stop at nothing to make sure that that take made it into the movie. Ultimately, after around 7 weeks of recovery, Tom Cruise was back on set once again, flying a helicopter, so, you know, there's really nothing that can damper his spirit. And following his return, production moved to the Pulpit Rock tourist site in Norway, where audiences got a look at Henry Cavill in costume along with his mustache. That might seem like just an ordinary mustache, but that is the mustache. The one that had to be digitally removed for the Justice League movie, since the Joss Whedon reshoots took place at the same time as the filming for Mission Impossible 6. In perhaps the most bizarre way, Mission Impossible 6 now had one more thing for audiences to get excited for. They'd finally get to see the mustache they'd heard so much about, which all led to the year 2018. Where, after a little more filming in London, where Tom Cruise was seen running his heart out once again, it was time to really begin the promotional cycle for MI6, which kicked off on January 25th, starting with this image of Tom Cruise holding onto the side of a flying helicopter, which came in conjunction with the official reveal of the 6th film's title, Mission Impossible Fallout. But as exciting as it was to get an image and a title, all of it paled in comparison to when promotion really kicked off on February 4th, the night of the Super Bowl. It was here that marketing for Fallout kicked off with the first 30 seconds of footage. But as exciting as that was, it was only the beginning, as it merely led right into a full 2.5-minute trailer that debuted online.
Your mission. Should you choose to accept it? I wonder, did you ever choose not to?
This trailer shows off a far more bleak tone than its predecessor, as the stakes have been raised to new heights, and Ethan Hunt's prior actions could have a devastating effect on the present mission. All the while, we see plenty of new and familiar faces, as well as the Mission Impossible brand of incredible action. Some of the key moments are a quick sequence where Ethan Hunt takes over a helicopter and nearly flies it into a truck, followed by the infamous moment where Tom Cruise actually breaks his ankle, clearly in view in the trailer, by the way. That footage also debuted on the Graham Norton show only a few days earlier, adding some additional promotional buzz. But perhaps the most exciting and pulse-pumping moment is this. That's Henry Cavill's character reloading his arms before beating the piss out of a bad guy, and it rules. Despite having been around for 2 decades, Mission Impossible had no plans of stopping anytime soon, and Fallout instantly became one of the most anticipated movies of 2018. And that excitement only built from here, because as the weeks continued and production finally wrapped in March of 2018, some more information started to unfold, including the reveal of a death-defying stunt in which Tom Cruise dropped out of a plane 25,000 feet in the air. Footage of which debuted at CinemaCon in April, absolutely blowing away everyone in attendance. Unfortunately, none of that footage was made public, at least not until the release of the second theatrical trailer in May. Across another 2 minutes, this trailer continues to show off the impressive action, a little bit of humor, but overall darker tone, as well as hinting at some deep-rooted conflict between Tom Cruise's Ethan Hunt and Henry Cavill's August Walker, all before revealing the highly publicized 25,000-foot jump. And while there isn't much of that in this teaser, a featurette came out not long after breaking down how incredibly difficult and intricate the stunt was. All signs pointed to one inevitable outcome. No matter how good Ghost Protocol and Rogue Nation were, Fallout was going to try its damnedest to blow them out of the water. And in the final weeks leading up to release, TV spots, posters, and new featurettes debuted, keeping fans and audiences excited for this late addition to the summer movie season, all of which finally led to July 27th, 2018. Where 22 years after the original film debuted, after a series of largely disconnected and distinct sequels, Mission Impossible was back on the big screen after its shortest break yet. And after early reviews were already praising this latest installment, it was time to jump on over to theaters for not just one of the most anticipated movies of the summer, but the IMF's most daring mission yet. Ethan Hunt starts this movie by making an incredibly difficult choice: to save the life of his friend Luther or allow plutonium to get out into the open, potentially resulting in the deaths of millions. In this instance, Hunt saves Luther, but the consequences of this hang over the entire movie that follows, including the ultimate moral question of whether it is better to choose to save the one life or the millions. All the while, Ethan Hunt's past comes to haunt him as Solomon Lane is brought back into play. This, combined with nightmares of his wife Julia, really give this movie a much darker tone to play with. As much fun as Rogue Nation and Ghost Protocol were, the smart decision was made to not follow down that path for a third time in a row. Instead, what we get is an intense, pulse-pounding, and utterly fantastic action movie. It might have seemed like an impossible mission to try and top the last 2 movies, but this movie succeeds in more ways than one, and it makes it look easy in the process, despite every single aspect of this no doubt being some of the most difficult things to pull off. A lot of this comes down to returning writer-director Christopher McQuarrie, who, despite being the first and so far only director to return, strides were made to keep this one distinct, even from his previous outing. While there's still a knack for geographical clarity, the color grade has been significantly muted, almost given a noir-like look to this movie, as there's lots of silhouettes, some lens flares, which gives it this foreboding terror. This is also accentuated by the new score, this time composed by Lorne Balfe, who brings forth an almost Dark Knight-esque kind of sound. The music has a lot of bass, a lot of percussion, a lot of bongo drums, as well as a nice piano theme that runs through the whole thing. At the same time, the score follows in Rogue Nation's footsteps by continuing to work the Mission Impossible theme into the main score, most specifically during a major exchange scene. It's funny because the Mission Impossible theme is really fun. You know, it's fast, it's light, it brings up the mood, but here, this scene is built for maximum tension. So instead, the main theme is slowed down a little bit and continuously builds and builds the longer the scene goes on. It's crazy how those changes turn this fun theme into a theme ripe with tension. On top of all of that, the cast, new and returning, are great. Simon Pegg brings a great deal of levity as Benji Dunn, Ving Rhames is the much-needed rock that keeps the whole thing grounded, being Hunt's closest friend. Rebecca Ferguson, of course, steals the show as Ilsa Faust, once again tangled in a web that dangles around the entire story. Then we have the newcomers, Vanessa Kirby as the elusive and mysterious White Widow, Angela Bassett as the new CIA director Erica Sloan, and of course, there's Henry Cavill as August Walker, who's immediately introduced as a counter to Ethan Hunt.
You use a scalpel. I prefer a hammer.
And that conflict lies at the center of this movie, as these two characters are constantly at odds, which just makes it all the more thrilling when Walker turns out to be the film's main villain. Working with returning villain Solomon Lane, who, played by Sean Harris, is once again super menacing here. And all of this serves some of the best action in the entire series. It's rare to have a franchise going on for this long that's still trying to top itself and do better with each outing. Because while the previous movies all had that one big set piece, that one major sequence that displayed all of the best tools and was likely also the center of the marketing, this movie doesn't do that. This movie doesn't have that one major sequence, because instead, every single sequence is like that. Each and every action scene is built up to create maximum tension, move the story forward, and of course, include some insane stunt work. It all starts with this halo jump right out of the gate, where Hunt and Walker have to dive out of a plane and deploy just above the city of Paris. Not only was the entire jump done for real, with Tom Cruise falling mere feet away from the camera, but the way the scene is staged is incredible. I mean, it's constantly putting these wrinkles in the way of Hunt and Walker's mission. All the while, we see the ground moving closer and closer, making for a really unique ticking clock. The music builds and builds as they quickly get closer and closer to the ground until Hunt suddenly pulls both of their chutes and they land on the ground safely, giving this huge sense of relief. But then it swiftly transitions into the bathroom fight, which is just an amazing display of hand-to-hand fight choreography, performed insanely well by the stunt team, Henry Cavill, Tom Cruise, and of course, Liang Yang. Without all of them, this sequence doesn't come together the way it does. But the action doesn't stop there. You then have this enormous set piece in Paris, which already has so much tension going in before the thing even starts. Because in order to impress some villains, Ethan Hunt is told that he must free Solomon Lane. And their plan, as we see in a flash-forward/dream sequence, is to kill literally everyone. And we know that this doesn't sit well with Hunt. Not only has this been established in this movie, but by the previous movies as well, particularly MI2.
He'll undoubtedly engage in some aerobatic insanity before he'll risk harming a hair on a security guard's head.
But then, as the tension builds and builds and the pivotal moment approaches, we know what they want Hunt to do, we know what he doesn't want to do, and it all leads to the moment when... tension released and a whole new plan is afoot, this time with Luther and Benji sneaking Lane away, which is fun. And then of course, in order to get away from the cops, Hunt winds up on a motorcycle, racing through the streets of Paris. Because you can't have a movie like this without Tom Cruise riding a motorcycle on his own without wearing a helmet. And you can tell he's really there too. Not just in the fact that you can see his face, but it allows the shots to open up. There's no cheating going on, and you can just see it on his face. He's not just riding the motorcycle through the city, he's performing as Ethan Hunt. It's crazy. But it doesn't end there, as it then transitions into a car chase, with tons of crazy stunts, like driving backwards over a small series of stairs. Then, of course, there's a massive scene where Ethan Hunt runs to chase after August Walker. Not only does this sequence provide a nice dose of humor, thanks in large part to the ever-great Benji.
What are you waiting for?
I'm jumping out a window!
What do you mean you're jumping out of a... Oh, sorry, I had it in 2D. Good luck.
But it also shows off a Tom Cruise running scene that can rival the moment in Mission Impossible 3. Mainly because it also contains the moment where he breaks his ankle. Yeah, that one hurt. You can see it. But where this movie really shows off is during the final sequence of the movie, where Hunt and the IMF team, now including Ilsa Faust, have found the plutonium they've been looking for. The plutonium, of course, has been armed by Lane and Walker, meaning the team only has a certain amount of time to defuse the two bombs, and they have to defuse them at the same time after the countdown starts and after the failsafe pin is pulled from the detonator. If they cut the wires before the failsafe pin is pulled from the detonator, the bombs go off. We got a ticking clock clock, we got stakes, we have several pieces going on at once, so everyone has something to do. But even though the threat of millions dying is certainly a daunting one, the movie makes one ingenious decision that flips everything on its head.
Ethan?
Julia?
This is where Julia turns up, Hunt's wife. As important as the millions of lives are, the one life is just as important. Not just to Ethan Hunt, but also to the audience. We have a character here that we care about, and even if you've only seen this movie, you still understand why Ethan cares about her. And just by putting this one person in harm's way, the stakes rise exponentially for the action that ensues. The action, of course, sees Ethan Hunt grab onto the bottom of a helicopter, fall off the bottom, of course, then climb back up to then take over the helicopter to then take down the other helicopter that Walker is in.
What the hell is he doing?
I find it best not to look.
It all builds and builds as each of these pieces get closer and closer to disarming the bombs, and yet the closer the clock ticks to zero, the further away they seem from victory. But hey, at least Julia gets to be a part of the action, helping Luther to disarm one of the bombs.
Wire strippers.
I'm a doctor, not an electrician.
Sorry. The thing with the green grip.
Got it.
The wire in my left hand.
The black one.
My left hand.
That's your left hand.
Sorry, the other wire.
The red one.
Yes, the red one in my right hand.
Just checking. Oh, I like her.
And boy is the helicopter stunt insane. Again, because it's actually Tom Cruise flying the helicopter, the cameras can capture the environment around him. You see the landscape fly by. And did I mention that Tom Cruise is actually flying that helicopter and acting at the same time? Because he is. That's entirely true. And it makes for an exhilarating sequence. And it all builds to a final confrontation between Hunt and Walker on the side of this cliff. A confrontation that cleverly continues to remind the audience of this cord that's barely hooked onto the ground. All the while, a fight with Solomon Lane keeps Ilsa and Benji from disarming one of the bombs. We got all these spinning plates, all of these moving pieces, yet the goals are clearly established, as are the consequences. As such, the tension builds as the clock ticks more and more. Thankfully, Ilsa and Benji do ultimately take down Lane, and they do finally get to the wire that will defuse the bombs, but they have to wait. They don't know if Hunt's got the failsafe key. Of course, Hunt is hanging off the side of a cliff, climbing further and further up towards the detonator, and Walker's right on his tail. He's so close, yet so far. So what does he do? But even with Walker down, the clock's still ticking. They're getting closer. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. Can they do it? They gotta cut those wires. Is it gonna work out? I don't know, but they gotta cut the wires now! Right at the last possible moment, Ethan Hunt managed to get the key, allowing Benji, Ilsa, and Luther to disarm the bombs safely. And with that, the tension releases and everyone in the audience sits back, realizing how tightly they were gripping their seats. That's the kind of stuff that sets this apart from the pack. There's a clear setup of objectives, obstacles, and wrinkles, as well as the looming ticking clock that gives everything this sense of urgency. This movie is absolutely fantastic at that during every single sequence. But now, the mission is complete. Lane is taken to MI6, Ilsa is no longer in a tangled web, and the IMF will live on to fight another day. And as for Julia, she'll sleep better at night knowing Ethan Hunt is out there to save the world. Because saving the one life is just as important as saving the millions. And that's Mission Impossible Fallout. Critical reception to Fallout was the most positive it had been for any of these movies. Critics and audiences were blown away by the set pieces, the characters, and even the twisty, mask-pulling espionage story, of which there are 2 mask pulls in this one, which manifested in the best box office haul for the entire franchise, as Mission Impossible Fallout raked in a massive $220 million domestically and $791 million worldwide. With such positive reviews, Mission Impossible Fallout wasn't just named the year's best action movie, but one of the best action movies of all time, rivaling that of Fury Road in 2015. Across 6 movies, the Mission Impossible franchise has outdone itself time and time again. It started as a fun, sleek spy movie, then became an over-the-top action thrill ride, then it decided to ground itself into a darker, more serious story, all before exploding into this series of increasingly insane stunts that keep the audience guessing at every turn. And because they're all done for real, it gives audiences an experience like no other. There's a winning formula here, especially with the partnership between Tom Cruise and Christopher McQuarrie. Together, they took a franchise that was already on its way up the ladder and made it one of the best action franchises out there. And audiences couldn't wait to see what they would cook up next.
You're fighting to save an ideal that doesn't exist. Never did. You need to pick a side.
Which brings us to the present day. After 5 years away, Mission Impossible is going to return to the big screen this summer for the IMF's 7th adventure. This time ominously titled Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1, with Part 2 slated to follow in 2024, both of which might potentially bring the entire series to a close, and both of which are once again under the helm of Christopher McQuarrie, reteaming him with not only Tom Cruise, but Rebecca Ferguson, Simon Pegg, and of course, Ving Rhames, the only other person to have a role in every single one of these movies. And they're all going to be joined by new players Haley Atwell and Pom Klementieff, but perhaps the most exciting addition to this next installment is none other than Kittredge. That's right, one of Ethan Hunt's main foils from the first movie is coming back to maybe ruin his world in Part 7. Not much is known story-wise about the next installment. There's going to be crazy stunts, crazy action. The teaser sees Tom Cruise ride a motorcycle off the side of a mountain. A featurette about that even premiered before IMAX showings of Avatar 2, showing off once again how insanely difficult it is to pull these stunts off and to make them look as good as they do. But it all begs the question, how are they going to top Mission Impossible Fallout? The ironic thing is that we've asked this question on all of these recent movies, and they've all managed to pull through for something spectacular. Mission Impossible is that rare franchise that the longer it goes, the better it gets. It'd be unfortunate if the series came to a close, but Tom Cruise isn't gonna live forever. Actually, I don't know that for sure. But either way, if this series comes to a massive and climactic close, it'll most certainly go down as one of the best series of films in history. From the action to the stunts to the characters and stories, this franchise does it like no other. And I myself am totally strapped in for the IMF's return this summer. Dead Reckoning looks really cool so far, and I am game to see what they've cooked up this time. Before I go though, I do have to thank one major source of information that I genuinely could not make this video without, and that's the Light the Fuse podcast, an entire podcast dedicated exclusively to Mission Impossible. Hosted by Drew Taylor and Charles Hood, these guys know everything there is to know about Mission Impossible. They've interviewed tons of the people who've been involved with this series, including Christopher McQuarrie on a number of occasions, and recently, they even got Tom Cruise. Their episodes, specifically on the behind the scenes of these movies, were an invaluable resource for me in getting this video made. So I'd like to thank them for being a great source of information, and I'd like to thank you for taking this journey with me, for watching this entire video all the way to the end. And who knows, maybe after this upcoming two-parter comes out, I'll come back to talk about how they might bring this whole thing to a close. Before that happens though, I'm sure to be back with another retrospective, this time on something a little more... Until then, however, this message will self-destruct in 5 seconds, and I will see you guys later.